My name is Anya.
And I'm Tiger.
And welcome to another episode of Anya and Tiger Do Occasional Podcast for School. This week we'll be having a bit of a story time episode, and we'll be telling you the story of Walt Whitman as a Civil War nurse.
These letters are brought to you by Emerson's classic, Self-Reliance. You are a poet. Not everyone can be a poet, but if you are a poet, you need nothing and no one. Not money, although you have some. Not privilege, although you were born with it. And certainly not me telling you, but I am telling you you need Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. You are a poet. Available now. You know how to find it.
So, Tiger, did you know that Whitman served as a nurse during the Civil War?
I didn't. I thought he was strictly a poet. I didn't realize he had any medical training.
Actually, he didn't have any medical training.
Wait, what? Then how was he a nurse?
He kind of invented his own form of nursing.
Is that safe?
Well, the way he did it, absolutely. It might be a little unconventional by today's standards, but he certainly did a lot of good for the wounded soldiers back in the day. He did a vast number of helpful things, not the least of which was writing letters to the loved ones waiting for the soldiers back home. Before I tell you all about how he ended up with such an interesting job, though, I wanted to read you one of these letters, just to give you a taste of the amount of heart he put into his work. Washington, January 21st, 1865. My dear wife, you must excuse me for not having written to you before. I've not been very well, and did not feel much like writing, but I feel considerably better now. My complaint is an affection of the lungs. I am mustered out of the service, but am not at present well enough to come home. I hope you'll try to write back as soon as you receive this, and let me know how you all are, how things are going on. Let me know how it is with Mother. I write this by means of a friend who is now sitting by my side, and I hope it will be God's will that we shall yet meet again. Well, I send you all my love and must now close. Your affectionate husband, Nelson Joppo. Written by Walt Whitman, a friend.
Wow, that's really something special. And it's pretty cool to see a letter from the Civil War, you know? I assume that most paper documents from that time got, lost or destroyed somewhere along the way, but I guess not all of them. It's a really cool snapshot of history.
It's awesome, right? The National Archives have a lot of really cool artifacts to look at.
It sure sounds like it. I mean, okay, so in any case, you were going to tell me about how Whitman became a nurse, right?
Yes, I was. So, long before the Civil War got started, Whitman actually used to visit injured ferrymen and dock workers in New York City.
Were they his friends, or did he just kind of visit people in hospitals?
Well, since he loved the waterfront and ferries so much, I imagine that he knew a lot of the folks that were working there. When he heard that they got hurt, he probably just wanted to check in on them and make sure they were doing okay.
Okay, got it. That seems reasonable.
Before we march too far ahead into the story, I think it's important that we set the scene. It's December in 1862, and the Civil War has been going on for just over a year now. Folks understand that this isn't just some little upheaval that's going to be easily smothered in a few months, but it's a full-on war, and we were in this for the long haul. Whitman and his mother have been anxiously poring over the New York Herald, and they've been hoping they don't see Whitman's younger brother in the long list of names of the injured. Alas, before long, George Washington Whitman is listed amongst the injured from the battle in Fredericksburg, Virginia on December 13th, 1862. Fearing the worst, Walt Whitman sets out for Virginia immediately, not knowing whether he'd find his younger brother, and if he did, what condition he'd even be in. After he couldn't find George amongst the wounded in the hospitals, he ventured into the Union Army camp, only to find his brother perfectly well, his only injury being just a small scratch on his jaw.
Oh, that's it? I figured if the Army listed him as injured, it'd be serious.
Apparently not. His brother was perfectly fine, and Walt ended up staying with George for a couple weeks. He spent most of his time exploring the camp, talking to soldiers, and recording what he saw. There's some really cool journal entries from around that time period. Since Walt was a civilian, he really couldn't stay with the Army forever. Eventually, he was getting ready to leave Virginia, and on his way out, he was actually asked to help move some of the wounded to Washington's hospitals.
Wait, what? Why? That seems like work that requires, training because the people are injured soldiers, right?
You're right, and they are injured, and usually that work is really arduous and difficult and specialized. However, at the time of the war, medical personnel were really limited. and the concept of skilled nursing hasn't been considered widespread yet. It was more important that the army had enough people willing to help than that they were perfectly skilled nurses. Therefore, Whitman made kind of a decent nurse by their standards. He was mentally and physically well, and he was willing to help. That's really all he needed.
Well, I'm glad he was willing to put the time and effort in, at least. Also, I'm honestly pretty surprised that Whitman was okay with being a nurse at the time. I mean, today, male nurses are still pretty rare, and the profession is still pretty gendered, it seems. I imagine the stigma and gender roles were even worse back then.
That's a really interesting point to bring up. You're right that gender roles were pretty firmly in place at that time in history, but nursing wasn't as stigmatized as it is today for an entirely different sexist reason.
Oh, good.
It was believed that wartime nursing was too gruesome for women's delicate dispositions, and it was a job that was only suited for men. Nonetheless, nursing was predominantly female in every other setting.
Of course.
So, at the beginning of the war, there were actually quite a bit of organizational efforts being made to set up some kind of form of organized nursing for wartime. Tiger, have you heard of Elizabeth Blackwell?
No. Who's that?
Only my childhood hero. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman in America to receive a medical degree, and she ultimately went on to open her own medical college exclusively for women. She was a champion for women's rights and was a strong proponent of women in the medical profession. She ended up spearheading the social organizations in New York to establish some kind of formal training program for military nurses.
She sounds amazing.
She was such an important role model and a brilliant woman. The only reason she got accepted to medical school is because the admissions committee had just sent her an acceptance as a joke. So she had to fight through a lot of hardship and a lot of struggle against a really male-dominated profession. Nonetheless, she persevered and became a really prominent figure during Whitman's time. In any case, that's not what we're here to talk about. Despite the establishment of this kind of formal training, not everybody was within proximity or had the ability to get this kind of training. Whitman, for example, didn't get this kind of training, and he wasn't employed through the government like many of the nurses were. He was employed through the Christian Commission, which was a branch of the YMCA. He was considered a volunteer nurse and a consolant of the wounded. Since Whitman didn't really work for any of the formal organizations, he kind of saw himself as more of a man of the people, like an advocate for the soldiers. Which brings us back to our previous discussion of Whitman being asked to help move wounded soldiers back to Washington.
Right.
From the first day that he was helping out, he was completely floored by the extent of the devastation of the war. He wrote about his first encounter with the carnage when he went to tour a mansion that was converted into a sort of makeshift hospital. He wrote, "Outdoors, at the foot of a tree, within 10 yards of the front of the house, I noticed a heap of amputated feet, legs, arms, hands, etc., about a load for a one-horse cart. Several dead bodies lie near, each covered with its own brown woolen blanket."
That's... wow. That's a really gruesome sight, especially for someone who's never fought in a war before.
It really is, and that exposure to the gruesomeness of the war was Whitman's first exposure to nursing, and it was the beginning of a surprisingly long and dedicated commitment to the practice. I mentioned earlier that he wasn't a technically skilled nurse, but he provided another service that was almost just as valuable. He would sit and talk with every single soldier that he was capable of reaching, getting to know them, providing comfort and solace. He would read to them from their favorite books, bring them treats like candy and fruit, write letters to their families, anything that they could possibly want on an emotional level in such a difficult time.
That's a really kind thing to do for them.
It is, and he was truly dedicated to the task. It's estimated that he saw somewhere around 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers during his time as a wartime nurse. The funny thing is, he never told soldiers who he was, and he never read from his own book. The experience was less about himself and more about giving the soldiers exactly what they wanted or needed at that point in time.
He sounds like a really selfless guy.
He was, in a way. I'd almost venture to say that he was born to be a nurse.
Well, okay, how did he handle the stress of that kind of job?
Not well, apparently. It's said that his physical and mental health took a significant toll as a result of his time at war. Alongside those mental and physical manifestations, Whitman was actually also deeply moved in his writing. He started writing incredibly detailed and moving pieces about his experience and those of the soldiers in his book, Leaves of Grass. I remember that during my first time reading through the war poems, I was so surprised at how crisp and clear the imagery he was painting was. up until that point, a lot of the poems I read were really ethereal and complex and grand, and so much so that I was sometimes having a hard time wrapping my head around the concepts that he was trying to convey. His war poems, on the other hand, were incredibly tangible, like he was trying to show the reader exactly what that experience was like for him.
Do you have some examples of those kind of poems?
I do. One of my favorites was The Wound Dresser. Here's a little bit of the poem. An old man bending, I come among new faces. Years looking backward, resuming an answer to children. Come tell us, old man, as from young men and maidens that love me. Aroused and angry, I thought to beat the alarum, and urge a relentless war. But soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead. Years hence of these scenes, of these furious passions, these chances, of unsurpassed heroes. Was one side so brave, the other was equally brave. Now be witness again, paint the mightiest armies of earth. Of those armies so rapid, so wondrous, what saw you to tell us? What stays with you latest and deepest? Of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous, what deepest remains? O maidens and young men I love and that love me, what you ask of my days, those the strangest and sudden your talking recalls. Soldier alert, I arrive after a long march, covered with sweat and dust. In the nick of time I come, plunge into the fight, loudly shout in the rush of successful charge. Enter the captured works, yet lo, like a swift running river they fade. Past and are gone they fade, I dwell not on soldiers' perils or soldiers' joys. Both I remember well, many the hardships, few the joys, and yet I was content. But in silence, in dreams' projections, while the world of gain and appearance and mirth goes on, so soon what is over forgotten, and waves wash the imprints off the sand. With hinged knees returning I enter the doors, while for you up there, whoever you are, follow without noise and be strong of heart. Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground. Or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital, to the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another, I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows holding a tray, he carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go, I stop, with hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds. I am firm with each, the pangs are sharp yet unavoidable. One turns to me his appealing eyes, poor boy, I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you if that would save you. On I go, open doors of time, open hospital doors. The crushed head I dress, poor crazed hand tear not the bandage away. The neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine. Hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard. Come, sweet death, be persuaded, O beautiful death, and mercy come quickly. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, wash off the matter and blood. Back on his pillow the soldier bends with curved neck and side-falling head. His eyes are closed, his face is pale, he dares not look on the bloody stump, and has not yet looked on it. I dress a wound in the side, deep, deep, but a day or two more, foresee the frame all wasted and sinking, and the yellow-blue continents see. I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene, so sickening, so offensive. While the attendant stands behind aside me, holding the tray and pail. I am faithful, I do not give out. The fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen, these and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in the breast of fire, a burning flame. Thus in silence and dreams' projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night, some are so young, some have suffered so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms around this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips.
That's a really vivid description of pain and suffering.
It really is. I was drawn to the poems he wrote from this period of time because of how poignant and direct they were.
Yeah, it's a really interesting glimpse into a side of Whitman's life that I hadn't really expected. Thank you for sharing that story with me.
You're very welcome. Before we close out, I'd like to leave you with another letter Whitman wrote for one of his patients.
All right.
Washington, April 29th, 1863. Dear wife, I am now to inform you that I have now been sick for 2 weeks. Have been for the past week in Armory Square Hospital. Have a pretty bad cold. The doctor does not call my disease by any particular name. I have considerable cough, but I think I shall be all right before a great while, so you must not be uneasy. I have pretty good care taken of me here, and I shall do well. I send you an envelope for you to put a letter in, as I wish you to write to me. I send you my love. I have this letter written by a friend who sometimes calls in to see me and the other boys. Goodbye for the present, and God bless you and all. David Ferguson. The above letter is written by Walt Whitman, a visitor to the hospitals.
Now that I know how much time he spent nursing, these letters really take on a different air for me.
Me too.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you all for joining us this week for Anya and Tiger do occasional podcasts for school.
We're your hosts, Anya and Tiger, and we'll see you next time.
Bye!
I'd like to thank Tiger Cohen for co-hosting this podcast with me, Sarah Bergman for her enthusiastic assistance with the commercial, and Dr. Whitiness for helping guide and facilitate this project. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to the Whitman Archive, the National Archives, and the UCSB Cylinder Audio Archive for their invaluable resources.